As we all know, 1996 and the rest of the latter part of the 90s was an interesting time for gaming, which would see a number of big names rise and fall due to the paradigm shift to 3D. Through this time frame, fighting games such as Tekken and Soul Blade would rise up and wow consumers with their advanced looking graphics. For some, flat 2D gaming was quickly becoming a relic of the past, and instead blocky polygons had become the flavour of the day. So in many ways, the writing was on the wall with regards to the consumer shift towards this graphical style. Nevertheless, Capcom chose to push through with their development of Street Fighter EX3 regardless, a game with some of the best 2D sprite animations the world had ever seen. Despite this though, many issues arose with this game at the time. Apart from people just generally not being that excited about 2D sprite based games, a further issue arose in the fact that the sprites in the game simply had too many animation frames for any existing console to be able to handle at the time of its arcade release. For this reason, it would take the release of the Dreamcast before anyone had the opportunity to take this game home, and that would be a few years later. In regards to the decision to make the game 2D, general producer Noritaka Funamizu explained, "We feel that 3D is not really suitable for the head-to-head fighting, and, to be frank, Capcom doesn't really have the techniques to display high quality graphics in 3D, which certainly seems to be the case when it came to their arcade hardware at the time, as all of their CP system arcade board games only featured 2D sprites." In contrary to this though, a polygon based Street Fighter game known as Street Fighter EX would see a release regardless, which was made possible due to Capcom working in partnership with a company known as Eureka. Eureka was founded in 1995 by a gentleman known as Akira Nishitani, the same man who had previously played a big role in the development of Street Fighter 2, even designing many of the characters. The company's first ever game would be Street Fighter EX, a game that was first released as an arcade game for the Sony ZN arcade hardware. As mentioned earlier, Street Fighter EX3 was programmed to use a lot of 2D sprite animation frames, which was perfect for the Capcom System 3 board, but no use for home consoles of the time, particularly the most popular system of the period, the PlayStation, that struggled with 2D gaming. This is evidenced by how poorly the Versus series ports run on the system, which we have already covered on here recently. Whilst the Capcom boards were not a suitable home for a polygon game, the Sony ZN hardware was pretty perfect due to the fact that it was based off of Sony PlayStation architecture, meaning that it would be the perfect arcade home for a game which was made with the intention of being ported well to the most popular system on the planet. So now we have discussed how a 3D Street Fighter game was possible despite Capcom stating otherwise, let us finally begin discussing the game itself. Like most games that carry the name Street Fighter, the game is obviously a head-to-head fighter. The game was the original title in the series to feature 3D polygon graphics, predating Street Fighter 4 by a number of years. In this game, polygon-based fights would still take place on a 2D plane, similar to that of Tekken and other games of the same ilk. With regards to this game, Eureka set out with the intention for this game's mechanics to be similar to Street Fighter 2 and the Alpha series, with the only major change being the actual polygon visuals. The thinking behind this was to release a game that looked visually impressive whilst maintaining the same gameplay long-term fans loved and adored. Outside of the cliché mechanics, there were still small tweaks in the gameplay that were implemented in an attempt to further make this game stand out. Changes included the character roster itself, which would mix familiar faces from Street Fighter 2 with completely new characters who were original designs. Interestingly, the player select screen itself is in 2D and drawn in an anime art style, which is an odd departure stylistically from the game's actual gameplay. Ryu, Ken, Chun-Li, Guile and Zangief make a return, who are all great iconic choices to include in a Street Fighter game in my opinion. Out of the new cast members, we have Crackerjack, a former bouncer from Vegas who wields a baseball bat, Doctrine Dark, an American-German mercenary who is seeking revenge against Guile, Pull and Perma, the daughter of an Arab billionaire, Skullomania, a third-rate businessman from Tokyo who works to support his wife and children, who also chooses to fight behind a mask to conceal his identity, and Hokuto, who simply trains in her family style of martial arts. To bolster this roster, there are also a further few secret characters and a final boss battle with Bison, all in all giving the title an eclectic little roster. This game lets all combatants fight it out on a 2D plane, however at times, such as when performing certain moves, the camera will change perspective, showing off a 3D arena. Special moves and super combos both make a return, along with a super meter. However, this game differs in the fact that the gauge is split into 3 sections rather than just levels, which is unique to the EX series. There is also a function in this game known as the guard break, which is a type of move that makes your opponent dizzy if you use this style of attack against one of your opponent's blocks. This varies from guard breaking in alpha, as it allows you to stun your adversary. In regards to the critical reception of this game, I can only find one source with regards to the original arcade game, and that's a review from Next Generation. The publication as a whole looked at this game as somewhat of a failed attempt to bring the Street Fighter franchise into a 3D environment. They stated that, while the characters are evenly balanced and have a handful of innovative moves, the game plays more like a distant cousin to the Street Fighter series, and is simply not as fun. Further from this, Next Generation also criticised the game's animation and backgrounds, stating they were not up to the franchise's usual standards. After the release of this game, in 1996, in typical Street Fighter fashion, an arcade upgrade version of this game would see a release the following year. This title, released on March 3rd, 1997, allowed you to play as all the hidden characters from the previous game instantly, and would add a further 4 hidden characters. The new lineup would even include Evil Ryu from Street Fighter Alpha 2. As expected with this game, it would only be a matter of time until a Sony PlayStation version would be published, which is exactly what you would expect really, considering the game was programmed to run on Sony ZN hardware, an arcade board based on the PlayStation. This version of the game, titled Street Fighter EX Alpha, would arrive on the system on July 17, 1997 in Japan. This game would build on the roster count even further, introducing both Dalsim and Sakura to this spin-off of the franchise. Bonus stages including barrel smashing were also added to the title, all in all making this the most complete rendition in the series yet. Now, with regard to this game, it certainly does not seem to be remembered by the masses to the same degree as Tekken, Soul Blade or even the Virtua Fighter series. So, what was it about this game that prevented it from becoming the stuff of legends? Let us delve into some of the journalists' response to this game of the time of release. GameSpot would state that this PlayStation game was a 3D Street Fighter game worthy of its heritage, but by the same token is perhaps too closely tied to its heritage. They felt that whilst the game had strong points, it was perhaps a stepping stone to a more impressive Street Fighter game yet to come. They gave the game some criticisms, such as claiming the game doesn't attempt to be anything more than a juggling and combo filled game like Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo, but with the play, speed and graphic style of Namco's first Tekken game. What I guess they also meant by this was that the game was pretty dated in comparison to its 3D contemporaries, considering Tekken 3 was already out by this point. They would also complain about the game's lack of an attempt made to give the characters any true 3D movement. GameSpot were also uninspired by the game's characters, complaining that many of the new characters just mimicked old characters in some ways. In terms of the game's fighting mechanics, they would heavily talk about the game's heavy emphasis on offensive attacking as opposed to the more defensive functions found in previous iterations from the franchise. They would state Street Fighter EX Plus Alpha is not a game for turtlers and not necessarily even a game for street purists. This is now less of a game of strategy than it is a game of action, without a doubt. To keep the game flowing, Street Fighter EX Plus Alpha has reasonably forgiving controls that ease the chaining together of combos and execution of special attacks. The game's visuals and audio would both be praised, with of course the exception of many of the game's new character designs. They would close by summarising, taken as a whole, Street Fighter EX Plus Alpha is a fun game with great gameplay, better than average aesthetics and a large number of characters. As we've seen many, perhaps too many times before, Capcom has a tendency to use its good Street Fighter games as a foundation to build truly great ones. How long will Street Fighter X Plus Alpha be worth playing? Your answer will depend upon how tired you are of traditional Street Fighter gameplay. As you can see, although sounding flawed in places, the opinion of this game given by GameSpot was all around pretty positive. But some of the best reception for the title was still to come. The UK PlayStation magazine stated the gameplay is as recognisable as the Taj Mahal, and that it was the most fun we've ever had with street fighting since Turbo, giving the game a remarkable 10 out of 10. They concluded, "This is like a second honeymoon. The true master of martial arts games remains unrivaled." IGN would build on this praise, stating, "This is one of the best Street Fighters and I think it's a good switch. It's still a 2D fighter, but it looks a whole lot better." The home version of this game sold over 400,000 copies, which is nothing in comparison to the over 20 million copies Street Fighter 2 sold, but over 5 times that of the 80,000 copies Street Fighter 3 in its iterations would later sell on the Dreamcast, all in all making the game moderately successful sales-wise. So from all of this, we can see that upon release, Street Fighter EX Alpha Plus received all-round very favourable reviews. So with all of this in mind, it does not really clear up as to why the game has faded almost into the realms of being forgotten when compared to the rest of the series, which can look surprising considering this game was the first in the series to enter the world of polygons. I rarely hear of anyone talking about this game or going back to play this today. So from here, I have decided, in order to look into this game's fate, to ask the glorious people of Twitter what their theories were with regards to the game being so overlooked. So we shall discuss some of these opinions now. Mean Machine Dean tweeted out, "I'd say it was a change of pace and mechanics, something which was quite different to what had been previous. The Street Fighter community are not big on change from my own experiences. I can only assume with games such as Tekken walking on their turf, they felt the need to make a 3D fighter." Dean brings up a very good point with regards to the franchise's biggest hits. Many of the games from the Street Fighter series that are celebrated today have a timeless look and appeal, mainly due to the timeless 2D sprite animations many of the games include. Street Fighter 2, 3, the Alpha and Versus series all include a range of games that have this ageless look to them. EX on the other hand is ugly and blocky in comparison and has aged terribly in the looks department. So I guess if you're looking to play the game in polygon form, you have Street Fighter 4 and 5 to play instead. Frednaught Sales onwards reinforces this opinion by stating the game is often forgotten now, probably because it didn't feel like a proper Street Fighter game, and even by PS1 era standards is pretty ugly. Metal Bayako criticises the game itself, stating that it felt stiff, clunky and a bit slow. The projectiles seemed to fly in slow motion, which, to be fair, is certainly true for EX, and as stated earlier in the video, is not as playable as the likes of Tekken 3, which is a game made in the same style that seems a lot more finely tuned. I guess a big factor as to why this game is less remembered is simply because there are far better polygon fighters to go back and play from the era. The video game newsroom echoes these sentiments by stating it's forgotten because it excelled at nothing. It was neither as fast or fluid as Soul Edge, and it lacked the innovative controls of Tekken, and it wasn't as deep as Virtua Fighter. Its only saving grace was the Street Fighter license. Street Fighter wouldn't find its 3D feet until Street Fighter 4. Anarchy Software too adds to these sentiments by stating, "I thought it was kind of lame. In a world of Soul Edge and Tekken, it just didn't hold up. The next year Bushido Blade and Mortal Kombat 4 came out, and I can honestly understand why no one remembers this one." Half Forward Circles agreed with this by tweeting exactly this, bad timing in Capcom's part. If this had have hit before Tekken or Soul Calibur, people would have been lapping it up, paired with the fact that they had pretty much hit the pinnacle of 2D with the Alpha series around the same time. It just got overlooked by most. Jordan Wiles adds to the conversation with the game by tweeting the game has bad controls and is just weird. Nearly turned me off the series. Street Fighter is good in 2D only, in my opinion. George Quayle brought the game's modern legacy and visibility into question by stating, "Doesn't help that its new characters have that weird, made by a different developer thing, so don't turn up in the comics, card games etc. as often either." What he speaks of overall weakens the game's presence today. IDFKA also stated, it wasn't nearly as influential as the 2D counterparts and was basically just Capcom jumping on the 3D bandwagon. I'm not saying it wasn't good, but it didn't take the series to a new level. Plus for new players it became a bit confusing where to start with which Street Fighter game. Raffle Zeus 2 also raises a good point, which also feeds into what I said about Street Fighter 3 in a previous video I made, when he simply tweeted one word: saturation. Basically there being too many Street Fighter games being released at this point, and an overabundance of fighters out there anyway. Other Twitter users, such as Growl here for example, admit that they played the game a lot in previous years, but have since ditched the game permanently. He tweeted, "I played it loads when it released, not touched it in years. I guess that would make it a game of its time. 3D was very flavour of the month, whereas it's pretty standard these days, and EX doesn't really do anything jaw-dropping." So to conclude today's video, although popular with journalists on release, the game goes largely forgotten and is fairly overlooked today. From my research and interactions, I can summarise that this took place due to the following reasons. The game has not aged as well against the sprite-based games from the series. It was inferior in gameplay to its Polygon contemporaries. Capcom oversaturated the Street Fighter brand by releasing too many games at once. And the fact that it was developed by Eureka rather than Capcom, which has led it to get less callbacks. Now moving back to my Street Fighter story, the year is 1998. It is another busy year for Capcom, especially for the Street Fighter franchise. June of that year would see the release of Street Fighter Alpha 3, the most polished Street Fighter Alpha game of the 90s, featuring an expanded roster. But prior to that, in January, Marvel vs Capcom Clash of the Superheroes would too see a release, the game where the Street Fighter cast would compete alongside other Capcom characters against the greater Marvel universe. Both of these games are well remembered and extremely celebrated today. Street Fighter Alpha 3 brought the Alpha series to a 90s climax, whereas Marvel vs Capcom was the most ambitious chaotic crossover fighting game the world had ever seen. Street Fighter EX2 is obviously the sequel to Street Fighter EX, the first ever Street Fighter game to feature 3D polygon graphics as opposed to the usual 2D sprites. The game from 1996 was released and developed by a company known as Eureka, which was owned by Akira Nishitani, one of the many men who worked on Street Fighter 2, who even designed many of the game's characters. Capcom reportedly outsourced the original game to Eureka due to not having the resources for being able to create their own polygon-based Street Fighter title at the time. This would include Capcom's arcade hardware itself, which was designed to run games that featured 2D sprite-based games. Due to this, Street Fighter EX would run off of the Sony ZN hardware, an arcade board that had components similar to the Sony PlayStation. Street Fighter EX2, on the other hand, published 2 years later, in 1998, would run off of the more powerful Sony ZN2 hardware. So was this enough to result in a more impressive experience? Let us find out. Time to look at this game's intro.
Street Fighter EX2.
Straight away from the game's intro, you can tell that graphically, the polygons look a lot less blocky this time, which is one positive to note instantaneously. The intro also shows off some of the characters who have never been in EX games before. In typical Street Fighter fashion, the first Street Fighter EX game had multiple upgrades in its own right. We had Street Fighter EX in the arcade, followed by Street Fighter EX Plus, an arcade upgrade, finally followed by Street Fighter EX Plus A. The biggest changes these upgrades would introduce would be expanding the game's character roster. The first game started out with 10 characters on the player select screen, joined by 4 unlockables, and by the game's final upgrade the roster would include a total of 23 playable characters. The true second instalment in the Street Fighter EX series would let you start off the game with 16 characters on the player select screen. The game's initial roster features many characters from the original EX roster, which featured a combination of characters from Street Fighter 2 alongside brand new characters that Eureka had developed in-house. Some of these were pretty memorable too, such as if you've played this game, who doesn't love Skullomania for example? Characters who are new to the EX series include some arrivals from the Capcom Street Fighter franchise. In this game's case, both Blanca and Vega, who are also both featured in the game's introductory scene. The player select screen also features two brand spanking new characters. These include Sharon, who is a gun-wielding hitwoman, and Hayate, a Japanese swordsman. In terms of this game's hidden characters, both Garuda and Kairi from the original game appear as unlockables. However, in terms of hidden fighters, there are also some more completely new characters in this department. These include Shadowgeist, a costume vigilante who is very similar to the lovable Skullomania, and Nanasi, a young girl who wields a staff. There is also a fifth hidden character, however, they are only accessible by using the cheat code. This final character is Cycloid, who resembles Cycloid Beta from the previous game in the series. In terms of the game itself, like the game's predecessor, the game is a versus fighter that pretty much follows the traditional Street Fighter formula. As a result, fights take place one-on-one over a best of 3 rounds. In terms of features that make the EX series unique, besides the jaggedy polygons themselves, the games do offer their own bespoke fighting system. Street Fighter EX2 borrows many of its fighting mechanics from its game's predecessor, which in many ways appears to be modelled off of Street Fighter 2 and Street Fighter Alpha. This includes the characters having the ability to perform special moves and super combos. Unique to this game though was the feature known as the Super Meter, a gauge with 3 separate sections rather than levels. Street Fighter EX2 also features the return of the guard break, another technique that would debut within the EX series. The guard break is a move that, if it connects with the blocking opponent, it breaks the block and makes the opponent dizzy. The guard break can be used at any time with one level of the Super Meter. This differs from the guard breaks in the Alpha series, as that technique results in creating an opening rather than a stun. Another mechanic from the EX series is known as super cancelling. This allows a player to string multiple super combos together for monumental damage. Now completely new to Street Fighter EX2 was a feature known as XL combos, which are similar to custom combos found within the Alpha series. XL combos allow players to connect a series of basic and special moves for a limited time. During an XL combo, the player begins with a basic move and can follow up with a different basic move or follow up a basic move with a special move, which can be followed by a different special move. However, the player cannot connect any move with the same move, nor can they cancel special moves into basic moves during an XL combo. It's all very complicated. So all in all, the things that make this game different to the original Street Fighter EX games are more polished graphics, a slightly different roster, new stage backdrops and the introduction of the XL combo technique. The game did not innovate a great deal really from the previous Street Fighter EX games. However, in typical Street Fighter fashion, there would of course be more than one iteration of Street Fighter EX2. There is money to be made off of releasing fighting games with minor upgrades over and over again after all, as who doesn't love easy money? 15 months after the game's original arcade release, an updated version of the game would also see a release in the arcade, titled Street Fighter EX2 Plus. In this new version of the game, changes to the title's fighting roster would occur. This would include Hayate being swapped out for Nanasi on the player select screen, who was originally just a secret character. M. Bison, Pull & Perma, and Darren, who were all characters from the first EX games but omitted from EX2, were back in EX2 Plus. In terms of new fighters to the series, Sagat would make his debut in the Eureka fighting series, and we would once again get some completely new additions to the roster. EX2 Plus would introduce Vulcano Rosso, an Italian martial artist, and Aria, who is a young girl who is equipped with a large mechanical right arm. Amusingly, the game also contained a non-selectable character known as Bison 2. This boss character appears in a white uniform and has an unlimited amount of super meter energy. he gains 2 variations of his Psycho Cannon super combo and is able to charge them to twice their normal size. Scary stuff. A further combo technique is also introduced to the franchise, known as Meteor combos. These are basically more powerful versions of super combos, which can only be performed when all 3 sections of the super meter are filled up. Every character in the game has at least one Meteor combo. After the 2 arcade releases and variants of Street Fighter EX2, Street Fighter EX2 Plus would finally arrive in homes on the Sony PlayStation. First in Japan in December 1999 and throughout many other regions of the world throughout the year 2000. The PlayStation release of the game would include an arcade, versus and practice mode, 3 features that remain standard tropes of fighting games. In addition to these though, the game would also include Satellite Smashing, which was a bonus game, and Director's Mode where you could record your fighter doing his or her moves, then edit the film after the recording. This version of the game would also feature the return of Hayate, but this time as a secret character. As you can see, apart from some graphical updates, new characters and a few new techniques, this EX2 game did not really build that much more on what was already available in the first EX games. However, this is just my opinion. Let us see what the journalists of the period made of Street Fighter EX2 Plus, the final rendition of EX2. Looking at GameSpot's take on the game, they would draw a similar conclusion to myself, stating that while EX2 Plus adds a few features and some new characters to the mix, it doesn't really have the overall flair that made the first game stand out. Graphically, EX2 has a more smoothed over look than the first EX did. While it does look a bit better than EX did, some players will likely miss the jagged yet defined look of EX. The effects have been bumped up a notch or 2, and super combos really explode off the screen as a result. Overall, EX2 is more of an upgrade to the original game than it is an entirely new experience. It looks very good and plays well, but it doesn't add enough new features to interest anyone that has become bored with the original. Don't expect the originality and freshness that the first game provided. IGN on the other hand appeared to be a lot more impressed with the game than both GameSpot and myself, with their review tending to have a particular focus on the game's graphics. They stated that if you're going to take a successful 2D franchise into 3D, this is how it's done. Out of all of the 2D turned 3D fighters out there, EX2 is easily the prettiest. This sequel offers smooth edges and textures that, while not amazing, fit perfectly, yet again proving that less can mean more. Street Fighter EX2 Plus preserves the nuances of gameplay and graphics that have made the 2D title great, but adds a little innovation to the mix to make it a worthwhile purchase. In all these areas, this game shines. Head on down to your local video store and snag a copy. If it floats your boat, don't wait any longer. Nag the game for extended play at home. In regards to IGN's review, I suppose they were right. The graphics featured in the game were certainly decent for the time. However, let us be frank here. Looking at this game with 2019 eyes, they now look pretty ugly, and as a result the game has aged nowhere near as either Marvel vs Capcom or Street Fighter Alpha 3, which I guess would be the first of many reasons why people are more likely to talk about or revisit those games today than they are the likes of Street Fighter EX2. Apart from the graphics looking less appealing today, the very concept itself is less appealing too now. Street Fighter EX2 is just one of many games featuring the Street Fighter roster. There are many beautiful 2D games, many that define the fighting game genre itself. Then there are multiple ambitious crossover fighters that brought characters together who we never in our wildest dreams imagined sharing the same small screen. Street Fighter EX2, although it has a lot of merits, simply isn't as memorable as the other games from 1998. Even within its own EX series, the game probably achieved the least out of the trilogy, as the first game introduced us to the series, and the next game, which we shall look at soon on the channel, Street Fighter EX3, brought the 3D Street Fighter franchise to a next generation console. The whole EX series seems to be largely swept under the rug since the release of Street Fighter 4, the first 3D Street Fighter game developed by Capcom themselves using 3D polygons. I guess this is mainly down to the fact that Eureka owned the rights to all of the new characters that would debut in the EX series, meaning that none of them would resurface in other Street Fighter games down the line years later, like the majority of other fighters from the Street Fighter universe.
To understand how we got to EX3, let's first briefly recap as to why the other games in the series were released. Back in 1996, many franchises throughout gaming were changing gameplay and presentation styles, opting for newly popular 3D graphics. Capcom were not confident that they could do the Street Fighter series justice when using such style, so opted to release the next mainline entry in the series, Street Fighter 3, in a more traditional 2D. Former Capcom employee and member of the Street Fighter 2 development team, Akira Nishitani, had other ideas though, which would result in him and his company Eureka co-producing his own Street Fighter game with Capcom. This title would of course be Street Fighter EX, featuring 3D polygons and be developed to run on Sony ZN arcade hardware. This would result in the game being easily ported to the Sony PlayStation, giving the game a much wider audience than what was available with Street Fighter 3. Street Fighter EX sold well enough to deem the title worthy of a sequel, so 2 years later, in 1998, Street Fighter EX2 would hit the arcades. Whilst the first EX game was a breath of fresh air for the franchise, the second installment offered very little in terms of new features. A dash of new fighting mechanics were added, graphics were slightly improved, and a couple of new characters were added too, but all in all it was simply much of the same. The third game in the series, Street Fighter EX3, would arrive yet another 2 years later in the year 2000. We have a lot to talk about this game, but first let's check out the game's introduction.
Street Fighter EX3.
From the game's introduction, you would have instantly noticed that graphically, the visuals in the game were a massive step up from Street Fighter EX2, and the duel that ensues between Ken and palette swap Ken looks graphically more impressive than ever before. As you can see from the character select screen, EX3 features a sizable roster of fighters, with a lot of different characters to choose from. Including unlockables, this game features 28 different fighters, which is a decent amount. Like previous EX games, the characters mix a range of fighters from the classic Street Fighter games together with a bunch of characters created by Eureka for this series. This of course includes everybody's favourite Eureka fighter, Skullomania. Outside of just the graphical improvements, the title marks a number of changes for the series. The first of which being that the game was released on the Sony PlayStation 2, which straight away explains the huge graphical improvements over the game's predecessor. More interestingly, unlike other fighting games I've covered on this channel, this game is an exclusive and only appeared on the PS2 and no other platforms. The game did not see even an arcade release, meaning that this was the first game featuring Street Fighter characters that could only be experienced in the homes. I guess this was because by the time the PS2 was launched, arcades were slowly becoming less and less relevant, and Sony was set to make so much money from the PlayStation 2 that bothering much with arcade hardware at that time would have been a trivial pursuit at best. Still though, Capcom fighters that year remained in arcades, with Marvel vs. Capcom 2 and Capcom vs. SNK both seeing releases on the Dreamcast arcade counterpart, the Sega Naomi, around the same time frame. The Dreamcast really was the last console ever made that featured the old school mentality of bringing the arcade experience home. With regards to EX3 though, like other titles in the series, the game is yet another 2D head-to-head fighting game, featuring 3D polygon graphics. The game would see release in Japan in March of the year 2000, October 2000 in North America as a launch title for the PS2, and the game would reach Europe in March of 2001. Whilst graphics in the game have been massively improved, many of the mechanics found in Street Fighter EX2 have been directly carried over to this game. In these regards, both super combos and meteor combos make a return. A big change though is that guard breaks have been completely removed from the EX franchise, and instead a similar system known as surprise blows has been implemented in its place. The game also features momentary combos, which enable combinations of moves to be started, switched, and restarted, kind of like a super cancel. Many characters also have new moves, including Skullomania himself, who now has a vertical projectile. The game's main play mode is known as Original Mode, and is drastically different from anything found in either of the previous EX games. After selecting a character, you quickly find yourself in a 3-on-1 encounter, an interesting concept which I'm surprised took this long to be placed within a Street Fighter game. After winning this bout, you then earn the opportunity to recruit one of your former opponents to your team, which you guessed it, the game features traditional tag team matches. Players, insert Teddy Long joke here. Tag team fighting was getting hot within the fighting game genre during this period, as demonstrated in previous videos on this channel. The Capcom Versus series was in full swing by this point, and rival schools received moderate success too, so I guess it just made sense to add this feature into the Street Fighter EX series. In terms of the tag feature, the game introduces a mechanic known as the Critical Parade, which consists of your tag team partner battling your opponent alongside you simultaneously for a few seconds upon calling them, a rule taken straight from the Pro Wrestling Tag Team playbook. Anyway, during Original Mode, after every encounter you have the opportunity to recruit opponents and can recruit up to 3 different partners as you make progress through this 6-bout quest. These fights are a mixture of different stipulation matches, from tag team bouts to team battles, and as mentioned earlier, even 2-on-1 and 3-on-1 matches. The variation from encounter to encounter makes me wonder whether the Street Fighter EX3 team took inspiration from the success of Super Smash Bros. Of the Nintendo 64, which had been released in the previous year of 1999. The final stage of Original Mode places you in a 1-on-1 encounter with classic Street Fighter II boss M. Bison. Upon defeating him though, the end credits themselves deliver a slice of uniqueness by acting as a sort of bonus stage, if you will. As the credits scroll, you are rewarded with an infinite combo meter and have the opportunity to take down as many weak generic fighters as possible. This is the equivalent of Stone Cold Steve Austin taking on the current WWE roster. In fact, 6 or 7 of these are normally on screen against you at the same time, leaving plenty of room for some chaotic fun here. Within Original Mode, there are also secondary objectives, which the player can complete in order to gain platinum, gold, silver and bronze trophies, which in turn unlock various features. These additional challenges give the game an element of single player replayability that was not necessarily there with the first 2 games in the series. Aside from Original Mode, other fighting modes in the game allow you to set up tag team matches, team battles and even 4-player matches at will, allowing for a lot of options, especially when indulging in multiplayer fun. Outside of all of these play modes, the other standout feature to the game is the character edit mode, which is an extension to the game's expert mode, a play mode that had appeared in the first EX games previously. In this mode, you play as Ace, a fairly generic looking fighter who is somewhat of a blank slate, in that he has no special moves whatsoever. Special moves and super combos are required for Ace as you progress through this play mode. The moves can be purchased through the use of points, which are earned via completing achievement-like tasks such as performing a 3-hit combo or executing a combo that does over 90 points of damage, for example. Ace is a playable character in other modes in the game and becomes more and more useful depending on how much you have been grinding within this section of the game. So, as you can see from what we have covered so far, it looks like at the very least Arika were attempting to make an effort with the EX series and attempting to do things with the game they had not tried out previously. Now, with this knowledge in mind, let us take a look at how this unique game was received by journalists at the time. Yeah. GameSpot stated that Street Fighter EX3 takes the gameplay and additional moves of EX2, adds a tag team element similar to that of Capcom's own Marvel vs. Capcom, and drops it onto the PlayStation 2 for a quick and dirty fighting game that seems a little rushed, but still manages to be a lot of fun. While the character graphics used in EX3 look pretty amazing when standing still, the animation is the same as it was in EX2. Granted, you can't exactly add lots of frames to all the special moves and keep the game's timing as faithful to the Street Fighter series as EX3 is. But now that the 3D Street Fighters don't look all blocky and pixelated, the jerky animation really stands out. The music, however, doesn't always fit the action. Also, in an annoying demonstration of audio streaming, the music changes tunes on the fly when other characters get tagged in, so you never listen to one song for long. One track fades into another as soon as the action on the screen dictates a change. Street Fighter EX3 is the game that EX2 should have and probably would have been had this kind of hardware power been available sooner. The tag team fighting adds a nice new element that the previous game totally lacked. EX3 may feel a bit rushed in some spots, but overall it's a fun and great looking fighting game that won't disappoint long-time EX fans. So as you can see, GameSpot had some mixed thoughts on the game generally, praising the gameplay mechanics but criticising the animation and music, all in all resulting in them giving a pretty average score of 7.4 for the game. IGN's perspective of the game though seems to be a little more negative, with them stating in their opening paragraph that Street Fighter EX3 comes with little fanfare. It's a mixed bag of good multiplayer action and a few luscious special effects, but uninspired basic combat coupled with stiff controls. It's certainly not the best of the series. In a nutshell, EX3 is 3D Street Fighter with tag team combat and multiplayer capabilities. The game uses some of the PlayStation 2's massive polygonal power, but rarely ever scratches the surface, even though it's probably the best looking of the three in the series. EX3 simply feels rushed, uninspired and downright mediocre. Although players might be instantly dazzled with the size and look of the Street Fighter characters, once you take a deep look at them, the honeymoon quickly ends. Simple shaded characters that depend on boxy frames and bright colours simply don't do the imaginative former 2D characters any justice. All in all, Street Fighter EX3 keeps the tradition going, but not at its peak. Character response time isn't great, even with the power of the PS2. It seems that the response time in a game such as Street Fighter Alpha 3 is better. The characters are all stiff and mechanical in movement. With the increased technical features of the PS2, most people would conclude that lighting quick movement and blindingly fast attacks would make this Street Fighter the best in the EX3 series, but that's far from the case. The character design and overall level of detail leaves much to be desired too. In the end, Street Fighter EX3 is a middle-of-the-road fighter that lacks pizzazz and inspiration. Some reception elsewhere for the game was more pleasant than what IGN brought to the table though, with game critics stating that it had a group of pleasantly complex battlers that are very distinct in both visual and play design, adding variety and flavour to the mix. The variances in philosophy and conceptualization are extremely refreshing, adding that the interestingly offbeat touches are far superior to the dull and ugly side of the spectrum found in Street Fighter 3. Nobody liked that game at the time. Yeah. CNET would add that the tag team fighting adds a nice new element that the previous game totally lacked. EX3 may feel a bit rushed in some spots, but overall it's a fun and great looking fighting game that won't disappoint. Spong would praise the title, stating that it was a game of skill, practice and timing, and that it had nice features and fantastic special effects. They summarised it as one game that deserves taking a look at, whether you're a fan of the series or not. So from all of this, as you can see, opinions were fairly mixed on the quality of Street Fighter EX3. The game certainly has its pros and cons to it. However, aside from everything else, I think there is one major reason that few people remember playing this game. Aside from the fact that there were probably over 20 fighting games that contained Street Fighter characters by this point in time, and people were generally a bit fed up with Street Fighter by the year 2000, the game was massively overshadowed by others, with one game in particular we will get to in a minute. The Street Fighter diehard fans had generally found a deep appreciation for Street Fighter 3 Third Strike, Marvel vs Capcom 2 and Capcom vs SNK by that point. All great fighting games with 2D graphics that offered a quick response time for competitive play. So what was left of the Street Fighter fandom had moved on to those games. The fact that Street Fighter now had 3D graphics had already wowed people the moment the release of the first Street Fighter EX game occurred. So all this game really had that was new to the public was 3D Street Fighter with tag team mechanics added. The big issue here though was that if someone wanted a great fighting game that offered 3D polygons and tag team action, then the perfect game was already launched alongside the PlayStation 2 in the form of Tekken Tag Tournament. As mentioned multiple times before on this channel, the PlayStation brand was the most popular entity in console gaming of the time, and the Tekken franchise was the most popular fighting game with the mass public over the period too. Meaning that when Joe Public picked up a PS2 for the first time, they were highly likely to pick up Tekken Tag Tournament with it. Most people are not interested in procuring more than one new fighting game at a time, so Street Fighter EX3 was left on shelves in place of the much more popular Tekken game. Apart from being a more popular brand at the time, the new Tekken game got better review scores across the board than that of EX3, so the game was outmatched and outperformed on every level, finally bringing the Street Fighter EX series to a permanent close. Still though, the game does some interesting things, and was certainly the best looking 3D Street Fighter game right up until the release of Street Fighter 4, a game you could argue that it even influenced in a number of ways.
To recap our history, in 1996 Street Fighter EX would see release in the arcades for the Sony ZN hardware. Prior to this, all Street Fighter games had utilised gameplay that was built around 2D sprites, which had always proved successful to Capcom. But with the release of Tekken and Virtua Fighter, many wanted to see Street Fighter brought to the third dimension too. While this was a great idea in theory, Capcom neither had the technology nor the staff on hand to be able to pull off this very well. Previously they had released Star Gladiator in arcades, but it was rudimentary in comparison to polygon based games put out by competitors. In order to achieve a polygonal Street Fighter game, Capcom would hand development of such a title over to a different company known as Arika. What made Arika special was that the company was headed by Akira Nishitani, an ex-Capcom employee who had become well known for designing Street Fighter 2 and Final Fight, alongside Akira Yasuda. So not only did Akira already hold Capcom's trust, he had helped establish Street Fighter's success in the first place. EX would feature a similar fighting system to other Street Fighter games, but the linear plane in which characters fight often changes along a 3D arena. There were multiple other nuances too, such as super meters being split into 3 sections and guard breaks functioning differently. The most striking feature though was certainly the graphics and all of the new characters who had been mixed in with Street Fighter favourites. The game would receive an arcade upgrade in 1997 known as Street Fighter EX+. And since the game was developed on Sony ZN hardware, this made it easy for Arika to port the game to the Sony PlayStation that year too,
resulting in another updated version, this time for the home, known as Street Fighter EX Plus Alpha. The game would receive an arcade sequel in 1998 known as Street Fighter EX2, along with a home port known as Street Fighter EX2 Plus in 1999. EX2 would retain all of the features of the first EX game, but expand the roster size and introduce XL combos, allowing players to connect a series of basic and special moves for a limited time. Big change would occur though in the year 2000 with the release of EX3, a game that would function as a North American launch title for the PlayStation 2. The game included large graphical enhancements and the removal of guard breaks in favour of the surprise blow mechanic. Tag mechanics were also brought in, which would utilise features such as Critical Parade, calling out a tag partner to simultaneously battle your opponent for a limited time. The game would also include dramatic battles and other new features, but none of this was enough to stop the game from being completely obliterated sales-wise by the likes of Tekken Tag. At this point in time, it seemed like Street Fighter as a standalone brand had been milked so much that it had run out of steam. And when it comes to polygon gaming, Tekken Tag was way more impressive, rightfully outselling Street Fighter EX3. For a few years, Street Fighter characters would continue to appear as 2D sprites in various Capcom crossover fighting games, but the franchise would not truly return until Street Fighter 4, 8 years later in 2008. Despite the game's runaway success, popularity and 3D polygon-based gameplay, none of these future installments would include EX Fighters, which one assumes is probably down to the fact that those characters remained property of Arika. Speaking of Arika, through the years that they had been developing the EX series, they had actually developed another fighting game too, known as Fighting Layer, which saw release in 1998. The game that was published by Namco would feature 3D fighting gameplay that was very similar to their Street Fighter games, and would even contain some of the same mechanics, such as being able to cancel supers into other supers and universal guard break attacks. In fact, in addition to this game's own roster of unique fighters, Arika would even go as far as to include 2 Street Fighter EX characters amongst the game's lineup, Alan Snyder and Blair Dame, marrying up the two franchises early on. While both the EX and Fighting Layer brands would remain dormant for many years on, Arika would make the bold decision to release a game known as Fighting EX Layer, a game that included Skullomania and company for the first time in 18 years. Interestingly, in the huge gap in time between new EX games, it turns out that Arika had been pitching multiple ideas for a new Street Fighter EX game to Capcom for years. At one point they even created a working demo for the Nintendo 3DS, but Capcom had rejected every single pitch. In early 2017, Arika would drop a trailer showcasing their new EX fighting game that they had created in Unreal Engine 4. It was quickly noted by fighting game fans that this trailer had aired on April 1st, making many people realise that this was a hugely elaborate April Fool's joke. Even the video description would confirm this, stating,
"These are April Fool's stories and not being officially considered for release at this stage. So even if you contact the official Arika Corporation, there's nothing you can do at this time."
The response overall to the trailer ended up being so positive that Arika made the decision to make their joke concept into a full game, making me wonder whether the April Fool's Day trailer drop was simply clever hype and test marketing to begin with. Arika would soon show another trailer, and this video had the message attached to it:
Arika has decided to begin development on a PlayStation 4 version of mysterious fighting game title undecided, and make a public announcement on the final day of EVO 2017. This game will be the newest entry in the EX series.
The game would be officially confirmed at the competitive fighting game event, and development of the Arika self-funded fighting game would continue to progress along. Akira Nishitani noted that the company had just enough funds to see the project through to completion without any external help, while admitting that a new EX game was primarily a passion project. His goal was still though to make a new fighting game that continued to keep the company financially healthy. In November 2017, the game's Fighting EX Layer name was finally revealed. A public beta featuring 6 playable characters was made available to download on the PlayStation 4 on the 11th of December 2017 and ran for 2 weeks. The developers used the beta to test online connectivity and gather player feedback. The finished game will be made available to purchase on the PS4 as of June 2018. interestingly being on sale in two variants, a standard edition of the game and a low price light version that included less features. Over time though, the light version would be phased out, with the standard version becoming the sole consumer option. Initially on release, the game debuted with a smaller roster selection, with online play being the main attraction. But 2 weeks after the release, Arika announced a free arcade mode update, which could be added to the game 1 month after it first appeared on the market. During EVO 2018, Arika would also announce that Pull and Perma and Rosso of Street Fighter EX fame would also be made available as free updates as of September, and more characters could be added via free updates as the game was slowly fleshed out. On top of all of this though, one paid downloadable character could later be added to the game too, SNK's Terry Bogard, who was made playable within an EX game for the first time ever, which was a cool touch I must say. In terms of gameplay, Fighting EX Layer is a game that retains many of the mechanics of Arika produced fighting games of old, such as super cancels, juggling and more, all of which are possible by taking advantage of this game's 6-button layout. In this entry, movement is swifter than ever before too, with the addition of a dash feature which allows for more responsive movement than in any previous Arika games. GameSpot noted that the gameplay found within EX Layer is heavily defined by two mechanics. The first of these is the ability to chain attacks into special and super moves, and cancelling mid-air combos. EX Layer has the edge over many other fighting games with regards to how smooth and free-flowing cancelling feels. This can lead to spectacular impressive combos that involve multiple special and super skills that can be executed in quick succession. The game's fantastic implementation of cancelling combined with the great dash movement overall makes gameplay as fluid as one could possibly want. A new feature to the EX series with this one is the inclusion of what is known as Guji Boosts, basically a feature that allows for enhancements and bonuses during matches. To break down further exactly what this is, a Guji is a pre-constructed deck of 5 special skills that can be activated when certain conditions are met in a bout. The enhancements that these can lead to allow for the likes of increased movement speed, for example. Skills found amongst each Guji deck are purposely designed to be paired up well with each other. GameSpot pointed out that the Infinity deck contains 3 boosts to build-in super meter and 2 other skills that make use of this extra meter gain, allowing you to play by building and spending meter very quickly. Some of these decks are arguably more useful than others, while some require a lot of trial and error to get to grips with, but all in all this is a nice little feature that adds to the overall experience. In many ways, Fighting EX Layer has been heavily produced with the hardcore competitive fighting gamer in mind. The game consists of a roster full of cult favourites and takes advantage of a fighting game system built around experimentation that utilises many more technical aspects of the fighting game genre. In terms of review feedback for the game, reviewers on the whole were impressed with the gameplay that could be found, but many felt the game should have a bigger roster and more single player functionality. PlayStation Universe would write, the game is
a deeply engaging fighter that resurrects the Street Fighter EX combat mechanics of yesteryear. Fighting EX Layer's lack of single-player content unfortunately makes it difficult to recommend to folks who aren't rapidly engaged in its online multiplayer shenanigans. Those who are, however, will find much to enjoy.
Gamers Heroes would comment,
Fighting EX Layer does not have a lot of options or fighters to choose from, but it does have a lot of heart. A lot of work went into its design, and those looking for a fighter that is a little out of the ordinary should set out to master its unique system.
ZTGD would praise the game, stating,
For those who grew up with Erica's work, Fighting EX Layer is a pure joy to play. I hope they continue to support the game and add more and more content as it goes on.
Destructoid would be a bit more critical of the product when a journalist would write,
As someone who has been playing fighters for nearly 3 decades, I can get on board with Fighting EX Layer's lack of pageantry. What I can't accept quite as earnestly is its issue with roster playstyle diversity. The foundation is there, it just needs to be built up further.
GameSpot would love the game, commenting,
On a pure gameplay level, Fighting EX Layer is an absolute treat. What it lacks in bells and whistles, it delivers in pure fun combat. This is a game made for the sort of people who will spend hours perfecting an impractical, extremely precise combo and training mode simply for the satisfaction of having done it. If that describes you, then Fighting EX Layer will be worth everything you put into it.
To summarise, I think it is beyond cool that Eureka made the 4th game in the EX series, 18 years on from the last entry, even if they did not have Capcom's publishing assistance this time around. It is beyond awesome to see the lineup of EX fighters resurface so many years removed from the originals. The title basically is Street Fighter EX4, with a cast of characters to back that up. Interestingly, since this game has launched, the EX brand has continued to breathe new life. This includes the debut of a female version of Skullomania, who is playable in SNK Heroines Tag Team Frenzy, and even the inclusion of Fighting EX Layer costumes within Street Fighter V itself. So the Capcom Eureka crossover work has resumed, at least to some small extent. All in all, I feel the emergence of Fighting EX Layer has proved to be a very interesting recent entry in gaming history that is heavily built on EX's legacy, something that until fairly recently was largely ignored. Seeing Skullomania and friends rise like a phoenix from the ashes has been an entertaining scenario, leaving me pondering what is next for these underutilised fighters. So, ladies and gentlemen, that was the mad story of Fighting EX Layer, the long-awaited sequel to the Street Fighter EX series. Let me know in the comments what you thought of today's video. I'd also be keen to know if you have had much experience with this game, and what you thought of the whole thing. For regular fighting game history, beat 'em up content and more, make sure you subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell to never miss a video. And if you're a hardcore supporter of my work, or have a love for Skullomania, you may too have a love for Double Dragon Neon Skullmageddon, who this week on Patreon I've uploaded a Patreon beat 'em up biopic episode covering this character's history. In fact, I now have nearly a dozen exclusive videos you can unlock for just $5, and I add a new one to the exclusive library weekly. So if you want to help ensure the future of this channel, and also get way more videos, then I'd love to hear from you over on the Patreon platform. Speaking of patrons, thank yous go out to Sebastian Velez, Carl Johnson, The Murder of Crows, Heo Paulo Lopez, Joseph Razmik, Ben Harradine, Corian Marcinia, Capcom vs SNK, BXL Gotham, Rowan Dinch, Evan Border, Philip Namph, Azra Arakai, Keith Ferguson, Jock Grimdarella, Michael Cullix, Ego, Jordan Durant, Adrielite85, Nick Daniels, Princess Zana, Glennie Glenn, Daniel Daly, Computer Man, House of a Ted, Gary Pinkett, ECU Professor, Kid Anime, Justin Wang, Aaron McNamara, Hermes Gonzalez, Instant Gratification Monkey, Man Shovel, James Bishop, JB, Michael Hall, Wesley Sang Hee, Wayne Kerr, Langston Miller, Noob, Brian Barry, Sarah Powell, Vlaming Renee, Marvin Araliga, Chris Cool, TOG Driver, Adrian Hannington, Bernard NG, Richard Stu Stewart, James McDonald, Dan Van Dammit, Lewis Viant, John Bates, David Bowell, Chris Fisk, Mike Bruno, Rick67, Antonio Rodriguez, Craig Jenkins, Retroverse.com, KC Wright, Synth Spaces, Zai, Andrew Bazanski, Gunther Hendricks, and everybody else who backs me over on the Patreon platform. Thank you to everybody who continues to tune into this channel. I love you all very much. Thank you. Cheerio.